Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Dr. Jenny Linker, and I currently serve as NDSU's Program Coordinator for the Undergraduate Health and Physical Education programs, as well as our online Masters of Science option in Leadership, Physical Education, and Sport. This presentation is titled Physical Education, a Premier MTSS Tier 1 Support, and the goal of this conversation is really to make sure that physical education as well as health education are key players and at the table for MTSS discussions and SEL discussions at your schools. So a little overview. We'll start off with some foundations and frameworks. Then we'll move into looking at alignment of curriculum between the North Dakota PE and health education standards and the social emotional learning goals for the state. Then we'll talk briefly about high quality physical education and a little bit about health education, and finally take a peek at some of the strategies that we might be able to use to bolster our current practices and explore some new opportunities to again make sure that we are advocating for our professions and the contributions that we can make towards MTSS and SEL systems within our school. So as many of you are well aware of, the CDC WISC model, whole school, whole community, whole child, really looks to put the child at the center of everything that we do and try to figure out how we can best support the child through multiple modalities and components. And it emphasizes the role of community in supporting the school, as well as the connections that occur between health and academic achievement. It also has a special place for acknowledging that evidence-based school policies and practices play a large role in how children are fostered in their development. So here's the WISC model graphic, and you can see the red arrows are pointing towards a few of the key components, and those would be our physical education and physical activity or SISPAP programming, as well as our health education components and social emotional climate. And so those three component areas can really work together to foster coordinating policy, process, and practice in our school in order to improve the learning and health of our students. So many of you probably also are well aware that your schools are working on their multi-tiered systems of support. And this is one framework that can help support the whole child approach. And this framework is really there to provide all students with the best opportunities to succeed academically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally. It focuses on providing high quality instruction and interventions that match with student needs, while also making sure that we're monitoring the process so that we can use data to make good decisions about instruction and goals for our students. And so the 5 essential components of this framework are assessment, data-based decision-making, multi-tiered instruction, infrastructure and support mechanisms, and fidelity and evaluation. And so we are going to be focusing on the multi-tiered instructional piece. So within ND MTSS systems, they identify 3 tiers of support. At the bottom level, tier 1, we've got our primary level prevention and core instruction. And this is really for all students. And it looks at our curriculum. It also looks at how we differentiate instruction. And really, I like to think of this as kind of like the proactive layer, where we're trying to instill things like social emotional learning. We're using trauma-informed practices and making sure that all students can benefit from these services. And so this is where I'm focusing today with physical education and health education, that we could be the primary tier 1 support. I actually like to say premier support. And so I think this is where we have the opportunity to seize the day and really play a much larger role in this at our schools. For tier 2 and tier 3, as you move up the pyramid, that just signifies that there's less students that are probably going to fall into these categories. It just increases the level of prevention and strategic instruction, as well as providing intensive instruction at that highest level. And just to be clear, MTSS does cover both the academic and behavioral side, as well as the social and emotional learning. So what is social emotional learning? If you have been to CASEL's website lately, which is the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, they have recently updated the definition as well as their framework. So social emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults, which is very key, acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And so their updated graphic, what you can see is from that definition, they have those 5 key areas, which would be self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And they refer to those now as the CASEL 5. And then around the 5 components, you'll see that our key settings include our classrooms, the schools, also our families and caregivers, as well as the community. And so really it's a systemic approach to help foster these skills among students and adults. And it occurs through instruction, our culture and practices, developing authentic partnerships, and aligning our learning opportunities. So in North Dakota, we're actually one of the few states that has specified social emotional learning goals. They technically are not standards. They are goals, and we have them for grades K through 12. And so if you go to the ND MTSS website, you'll be able to find several documents to support and show how SEL can be incorporated across the entire school system, as well as various content areas. And I'm going to highlight some of those documents for you now. So in their introduction document, you'll see that they are using the same framework as CASEL. This document is actually in the process of being updated, and I'm sure the new version will have the updated CASEL graphic. But they're basically staying in alignment with CASEL's language and what they define as the 5 major components. So in North Dakota, now that we've got these SEL goals, I like to try to tie us back to North Dakota physical education standards. And so when we look at the standards, our physically literate individual is going to be able to show competency in the psychomotor, cognitive, and affective domains. And if you look at standards 3, 4, and 5 at the red language, skills to achieve and maintain a health-enhancing level of physical activity and fitness, exhibiting that responsible personal and social behavior, also recognizing the value of physical activity for health, enjoyment, challenge, and self-expression and or social interaction. It has a lot of commonality with the SEL CASEL 5. And so when we switch over and also look at health education, we see a very similar theme where we're understanding the concepts and analyzing the influence, looking at using interpersonal communication skills, being good decision makers, being able to set goals and practice our health enhancing behaviors, and also advocating for ourselves and our family and community health. What's really nifty is that within the NDSEL goals document, in that intro document down at the bottom, you'll notice they have the North Dakota State Standards crosswalk. And so they went through and they looked at North Dakota's SEL goals to see where do they align with the current standards in the various content areas. And so when you click on that, what you'll find is that physical education and health education are highly aligned already. So we have numerous benchmarks and outcomes that already contribute to social emotional learning. And so I think it's really important as we advocate for our content areas that we make sure that not only do we and our colleagues know about this, but our administration and our classroom teachers that we work with on a daily basis are also aware to show that we can be contributing partners in these efforts at our schools. Just to bring the alignment a little bit closer, so on the left-hand side we have some of the goals for self-management. which again is one of the Castle 5. And if you look at our PE grade level outcomes, we've got one here for Standard 3, Middle School Outcome 18 for Grade 6, as well as Standard 4 for Middle School Outcome 2, also in Grade 6. And as you read the language, you can see that we've got great alignment. So for example, identifying positive and negative results of stress and appropriate ways of dealing with each clearly aligns in the 6th to 8th grade ND-SEL goals of self-management, being able to apply stress management strategies. Our friends in health are doing a great job too, and we can see we also have curricular alignment with several of those standards. And an example here would be demonstrating effective verbal and nonverbal communication skills, and we can see that aligns with the SEL goal of explaining possible outcomes of expressing emotions. The second one talks about how to describe personal health goals and how they can vary with changing abilities and priorities. And we have an SEL goal where we're trying to plan, prioritize, and manage time, and so they can work hand in hand. The crosswalk documents that we have in North Dakota are not the only place that you can go to try to look for curricular alignment. Shape America, about a year and a half ago, came out with the physical education SEL crosswalk, and they too use Castle's core competencies to align those. And then just recently, in the last couple weeks here, they just released the SEL crosswalk with the National Health Education Standards. So I definitely encourage you to go ahead and look at those documents. So beyond the alignment that we already have in both physical education and health education with the SEL goals, we also have this known evidence that physical activity in physical education supports SEL growth. So when we have students moving, especially when we get them into that moderate to vigorous intensity level, it helps their brains grow through neurogenesis and also helps all the neurons in their brains connect through neuroconnectivity. And so this can help things like executive function, which is housed in the brain's amygdala. And that area is responsible for impulse control, decision making, concentration, all things that if we can enhance will help improve academics as well as behavior. We also know that physical activity helps decrease symptoms of depression, anxiety, and just overall academic performance, whether it's on standardized tests or assignments in the classroom, can increase. So we kind of come to this golden opportunity where not only are we already aligned with SEL goals, but we also have physical activity that contributes to the brain's health, and it helps produce an environment where SEL can be fostered. So if we're going to capitalize on this connection, we need to kind of think about our current practices. And the first item in there is stopping the bleed. And I'm sure this is none of you, because you're obviously professionals and you're attending professional development. And so what I mean by this is, if we look at our current physical education context, if we have practices that are inappropriate going on, for example, classic humans as targets, dodgeball, we have to stop and ask ourselves, are we contributing to the problem? Are we trauma inducing? It's really difficult to help teach social emotional learning skills and use trauma-informed practices if our classroom climate and settings are actually inducing trauma. So I think it's always just a good opportunity to sit back and reflect and make sure that we ourselves are on the proactive and positive contributing side and not on the side in which we are part of the problem. So my first recommendation is stop the bleed if you have any bleeds going on at your schools. The second piece is, in order to be able to help instill SEL skills in our students, we as adults have to improve our own social emotional learning knowledge. We have to be able to practice it in our own lives as well as model it for our students. And so this is really probably the biggest starting point, is understanding like what is the common language of SEL. Has your school already established that? What do the individual areas look like and sound like? And how do you practice those on a daily basis? What are things that you do really well? What are things that are some opportunities to improve? Because until we ourselves are comfortable, it's difficult to really fully implement an SEL-based curriculum in your programs. The next piece is, I think, looking to see, does your current program have a formalized PE or health curriculum? Is it including SEL-oriented grade level outcomes and benchmarks? How are we assessing those items? I think oftentimes what happens is we do a fantastic job of focusing on our psychomotor grade level outcomes as well as our cognitive outcomes. We tend to say we include affective outcomes, but particularly I think at the secondary level, maybe we do so in an indirect way as opposed to a direct manner. So I think going back and looking to see how much are we emphasizing this in our curriculum, not just including it, but directly addressing it as well as assessing. And then as we're doing this, we need to be cognizant always of making sure that we have curricular alignment and that we're using backwards design, which means we start with our outcomes. We figure out how we're going to assess them, maybe you need to develop proficiency skills in relationship to those. And then you think about the instructional strategies and the content we will use to get ourselves there. So along those lines with having an established curriculum, it's also necessary to make sure that we have high quality programs if we're going to attempt to integrate SEL learning. Having a high quality program will just make things easier to incorporate different curricular alignments and foster that growth amongst our students. So a couple key documents to be aware of. Physical education program checklist is from Shape America as a guidance document. And what's neat is it kind of goes through and pulls out various areas on the left-hand side and then allows you to kind of go through and check yes, no, or if it's in progress and build in your comments. So it's a document that's all set and ready to go. So it's a nice way to just kind of go through and get a pulse on where your entire program is prior to embarking on this adventure. Health education has a very similar document. And again, it's in that yes, no, in progress, and includes the comment section. PE, we also have the appropriate instructional practice guidelines. They have them for the elementary, middle, and high school level. And I like this document in particular because it gives us the side-by-side comparison across the grade levels, and then it dives into each of the sections, such as the learning environment, instructional strategies, curriculum assessment, and professionalism. So for example, here's one. It looks at self-responsibility and social skills and talks about how physical educators design activities that provide students opportunities to develop their social skills through cooperative and competitive activities and learning responsible behavior. So again, these appropriate practices tied directly to social emotional learning. We have a similar document in health education, which also can be referenced and used. And you can see that they also have the ties to SEL by having things like activities that are culturally inclusive, making sure that the curriculum provides opportunities for students to reflect and foster their self-awareness. So again, hitting upon the Castle 5. So while I'm not going to focus on health education here, I am going to focus primarily on PE and some instructional models that I think are really useful once you've kind of determined your curricular alignments to SEL and gone through and made sure that you've looked at some of your high quality practices and making sure that everything is lined up, ready to go in order to foster the success of these being implemented. So the three instructional models I'll talk about are adventure education, teaching personal and social responsibility, and the sport education model. So adventure education is really one of my most favorite models. When I was a middle school teacher back in Massachusetts, I would always kick off my 6th, 7th, and 8th grade classes with an adventure ed unit. And the idea behind this is that really we're focusing on affective development, really setting the stage for our class climate and making sure that our students have the opportunity to get to know one another and practice their social emotional learning skills so that we can kind of set up the rest of the school year for success. This was really, really important for our 6th graders because many of them were coming from a variety of elementary schools, and so oftentimes in their 6th grade year, it was the first time they may have met some of the other students in their class. These are just some pictures of my college students. We talk through adventure education, and then we actually go out and experience it. Out in Minnesota, there's a nice ropes course, so we get a nice day of activities, and so they learn how to implement this in their pre-service work. So the basis of adventure education is it really is looking to foster a holistic approach to education where we are focusing on the physical, the cognitive, the emotional, and social, and we provide students tasks in which there's some sort of challenge and there's some sort of uncertainty in regards to what the final outcome will be. And these activities are sequenced very carefully to make sure that we are both physically and emotionally safe, but we allow the students to take ownership and gain autonomy through their learning and primarily focusing on the process, not the product. So for example, if the challenge was to get across the radioactive river, really it's not whether or not they got across the river. It's more so about how did they function as a group through the process. Did they listen to each other? Were they able to reflect? Were they able to build goals, work towards them, be inclusive of one another? And so really we will end up debriefing and talking through the process, and the product is really just it's just not an emphasis for the outcomes. So with the progression in adventure education, typically a unit in this would start off with some icebreakers, allowing students to get to know one another, find their commonalities, their similarities, build that climate. Then you travel into the partner activities, such as a partner walking tag. Then you get into small group work. The classic example is group juggle, where the group is all trying to see if they can keep X number of Nerf balls in the air without dropping them, and see if, as a group, how many they can get to. Then we get into bigger initiatives, such as lava stones or trying to cross the radioactive river. An upper level progression would be working into trust activities. However, trust activities are something that I don't recommend unless you have had advanced training through an organization such as Project Adventure or High Five Adventure Company, just because there is an increased risk of physical injury as well as emotional injury if you don't facilitate this correctly. Low elements would be when we start to get our students off the ground. So for example, All Aboard is an activity in which the students have to work together to get everybody up on a tire that's just laying on the floor. So it does have a little element of getting up off the ground, but it's at a low level. Doesn't require any additional harnesses or equipment to facilitate those. And then we have the high elements, where we might get everyone strapped into their harnesses and we can get up in the trees and climb around, such as we'd see at a challenge course perhaps. So this model is based on experiential learning, and so you can see Kolb's cycle on the left-hand side. I like the cycle on the right because it's the simplified version. Essentially what we're going to do is the students are going to experience an activity, and during the activity they're thinking about what happened. and what does it mean? And then how do we apply this to life? So, for example, if students were trying to cross the radioactive river and we noticed, as a facilitator that there was a lot of argument and there was a lot of group breakdown, we might pause the activity and do some debriefing and ask them, so what's happening right now? And students might say, geez, we're really having a hard time because we all are arguing and talking over each other. And then we say, okay, so how does that impact things? Like, why does it matter? And they realize, well, geez, it's really difficult because it's taking us forever to start doing this activity because we can't come to an agreement. And then we facilitate the now what. So, okay, like, does that happen in other areas of life? And how does that impact things? So they try to cross the content over to life experiences and recognizing strategies for how they can remedy those situations. So really, the activities really become a metaphor for building on those SEL skills, not only in the class, but outside of class. The second model is the teaching personal and social responsibility model that was developed by Hellison. And this is a model that could easily be used K to 12 as well. And the focus of this model is really on students' level of responsibility. And so Hellison has defined these levels 1 through 5, where, for example, in level 1, respecting the rights and feelings of others means that the student is in self-control, they're able to peacefully resolve their conflicts, and that they are being inclusive and can be cooperative. As you go up the levels of responsibility, they're going to show increased ability to monitor themselves, be motivated, set goals, extend themselves to others through leadership and be caring and compassionate. And then ultimately at level 5, it's being able to do these things outside of the gymnasium. And so how this works is that really at any given moment, you can have within a lesson, talk to a student and ask them, where are you as far as levels? Are you operating at a level 2, or do you think you're operating at a level 3 right now? And getting them to identify their behaviors and understanding what they need to do in order to maintain or improve their behavior. So it's a lot of self-reflecting and guided reflection with the teacher. In a typical TPSR model lesson, what would happen is the first part of the lesson would be spent on what we call relational time. And so that is just checking in with students. Many of you already do this. Your students are coming in, hey, how was your soccer game last weekend? Hey, how's your leg? Is that ankle feeling any better? So you're just checking in with them as the class is starting to get ready. They're filtering in maybe from the locker rooms, maybe starting their instant activity, and you're just getting around and building those relationships with your students. The second part is kicking off the lesson more formally and introducing what the concept maybe is for the day or the week or unit. And this is usually an affective goal. So for example, if the theme was going to be respect, you'd start off having students kind of define, what does it look like? What does it not look like? What does it sound like? What does it not sound like? Because oftentimes, we use affective words like respect, teamwork, but how children define that and how we define that might be very, very different. I know what respect looks like in my house might look different than somebody else's house. And so we have to take those words and break them down into things that we can observe and that students can better understand. So for example, respect, I would say that respect looks like high-fiving every member of the opposite team. It doesn't look like kicking the basketball at the end of the lesson. I would say that respect sounds like saying good job to not only my teammates, but also my opponents. And what it doesn't look like is trash talking during gameplay. So once you define that down in the awareness talk, you can then go back and reference those T-charts and those definitions throughout your lessons and unit. So after the awareness talk, You roll into your physical activity plan, which would be your typical psychomotor lesson. So if you're focusing on basketball, dribbling with hands, striking, kicking, whatever it is, you go forward with that psychomotor plan and you're still emphasizing skills. But you're consistently making sure that you're looking out for those teachable moments regarding the affective behavior. And so once your physical activity plan is coming to a conclusion, at the end of class, you're going to have a group meeting where you go back and you look at your theme. So our respect theme, you could ask the class, how did we do collectively as a group? Can you give me an example of something somebody who exhibited respectful behavior? And then at the end, we finally will hit up the self-reflection piece. So each student has an opportunity to self-reflect on how they did, particularly in relationship to the levels and this theme. The third instructional model is the sport education model. And the premise of this model is that we're trying to give students authentic sporting experiences in which we put them in teams. They stay together the entire season. Seasons are actually units that are much longer than we would typically potentially host a unit. So for example, a 21-day unit of soccer would be enough time to facilitate and really provide students with that authentic experience. It uses modified small-sided games and includes things like a preseason, developing techniques and tactics during that time, their regular season, and formal competition. It also gives students the opportunity to have leadership roles and autonomy by serving out roles such as being the referee, being, maybe the coach of their team, being a statistics tracker, and these roles, they would still be very physically active throughout the unit, but it's kind of a role they would have in addition to playing on their teams. We keep records during these instructional models, and there's always a culminating event. What's really cool is sport education can be used really with anything. It's not limited to just sports. You could easily do this with dance, gymnastics. You could do this with jump roping. You just have to be creative. I've done this with fitness before. That worked out really well and was much more motivating than my typical fitness unit prior to that. And throughout this, we're emphasizing fair play, making sure that we're fulfilling our responsibilities and teamwork. And so similar to the other two instructional models we already talked about, there's very clear social emotional learning ties in this unit that can be fostered in a fun and creative way. Other opportunities that are out there, Health Moves Minds. I'm sure many of you have heard of that. They have got their curriculum up. You basically just sign into the website and then you can gain access to those lessons. Not only lessons, but also they have suggested ideas for school-wide and community-wide events to help foster social emotional learning. The online physical education network called Open. If you've not registered with that website, it's free and you gain access to a ton of wonderful curriculum pieces. They also have social emotional learning based lessons on their website that I would definitely recommend that you check out. And so I know this is really brief, where I only kind of gave you a little teaser, as in those 3 instructional models that you might want to pursue in your physical education program. You'll have to kind of go and do the digging. If you're interested in the adventure education instructional model, I am offering some professional development this summer through NDSU. It's going to be an online course for 1 credit. And it's called SEL through Adventure Education, and it's open not only to physical education teachers, but also classroom teachers who might be looking to try to foster SEL through physical activity, which I always think is a nice benefit if we can get more physical activity in our classroom. So feel free to sign up for that if you like. But there's also a lot of other professional development out there. Shape America has really done a great job in the last year or so, really honing in on SEL and making sure that PE and health are part of that conversation. NDSU also has a new Master of Education option in whole child approaches. Again, that's physical education, health education, classroom teachers, really honing in on that WISC model. It is based off the WISC model approach, and students in that program have an opportunity to learn more about family and community relationships, CISPAT programming, as well as building upon trauma-informed practices and basic SEL frameworks. I think it's really important to make sure that as we venture into SEL integration in our classrooms, that we collaborate not only with our counselors and our classroom teachers, but also our SEL specialists and our administrators in our schools. They are great resources, and I think by expressing our interest in this area, we can not only help support our students, but also advocate for our profession. Most of your schools have an MTSS or SEL committee or team. Maybe your school is part of the North Dakota SEL network, which would be really awesome. And so, do our physical education and health education teachers have a seat at those tables? And if we don't, we should certainly be making sure that we join those committees and teams. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about data. As you instill social emotional learning strategies in your classroom, whether it's through isolated lessons or through more strategic units, I think it's always important to kind of collect data, and you can work with your counselors and SEL specialists to hone in what kind of data might be useful, because if you're really honing in on this and it's making an impact on your students, that's great information, not only for the MTS system, but also, again, to advocate for your program. And then last but not least, I think it's so important that we use the language that physical education and health education are premier MTSS Tier 1 supports. And so using the common language that is prevalent and also a top priority in our school, tying us to that language is very important. So I highly encourage everyone, to get out your soapbox and proclaim ourselves as a premier MTSS Tier 1 support for all students. And I thank you so much for bearing with me as I struggled through a video recording of my presentation. I will also be available on February 20th from 9 to 9:50 to continue the conversation. I'd be excited if you came and joined me so we could talk more about this. If you need to get a hold of me, you can find me at NDSU. It's just jenny.linker@ndsu.edu, or give me a holler on the phone at 701-231-8676. I wish you a great conference, and thank you for all that you do for our students.